Welcome back to another short take for AP US history. Today, we're talking about the 1970s. So how are we going to look at the 1970s? Well, it's a period of kind of the end of any kind of hope or optimism. Really, this is a period where people got really suspicious of everything that was going on. And you can kind of understand why. There was good reason. For one thing, there was extreme inflation within the economy. On top of that, the United States was making a lot of errors, both domestic and in foreign affairs. Everything from the Watergate scandal to a number of foreign policy blunders. This was the time period when Americans grew extremely skeptical, especially about the way that their government was operating. Okay, let's start off with the biggest problem at this time period, stagflation. What the heck is that? So basically from 1945 until 1970, the primary way the economy was run was through Keynesian economics. You might remember this. This is from John Maynard Keynes. The idea was the government would get involved to sort of smooth out the business cycles. Now, there had always been two big problems in the economy, inflation and unemployment. You can't do one problem and have the other problem happen at the same time. Then in the 1970s, both happened at the same time. Think of them as sort of like a seesaw. If unemployment were going up, inflation should go down. If inflation went up, unemployment should go down. And it makes sense. The more money it's in the economy, inflation, the better jobs are going to be. You can hire more people. But all of a sudden, both problems came up at the same time. What the heck was going on here? Well, there was an economist named Milton Friedman who made an argument about this. He said the reason why this was happening was that workers and unions had caused too high of expectations. They believed the government could come in and solve any problem. When the government did that, businesses thought the solution was coming, so they would basically raise their prices. And when the solution didn't come, they would fire workers. So in other words, we got unemployment and inflation at the same time. Now, add on top of that, two major oil shocks. Where were these coming from? OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, had decided to cut off the amount of oil production to protest US support for Israel. And this ended up causing a major oil shock or increases of oil prices, both in the early 70s and the late 1970s. This just contributed to the inflation problem. Okay, so there were a number of major foreign policy problems as well. America was getting out of the Vietnam War, but in order to get out of the Vietnam War, we decided that we just wanted to cut off ties. We stopped funding South Vietnamese government. And in the midst of this happening in 1973, there were these pictures of Americans trying to evacuate from Vietnam, including the Vietnamese themselves. These were disastrous pictures, helicopters taking off from the top of our embassy in Saigon. After this, the Vietnamese forces pulled back into Saigon and they were run over by the communists and taken over. Okay, second big problem that took place happened in Afghanistan in 1979. The Soviet Union invaded. Huge fears in America as the Soviet Union did this, that they were going to be able to capture major oil areas within the Middle East. Now, the truth we know today is that the Soviet Union invaded because radical Islamic groups were attacking the socialist government within Afghanistan. But the fear was the Soviet Union was expanding. And then, of course, there was the last major problem that we faced, which was in Iran. In Iran, the American government had supported a man named the Shah Pahlavi, throughout the 1960s and 1970s. The Shah actually did some amazingly positive things in Iran. However, he had a secret police called the Savak. And the Savak would go out and they would imprison everybody from liberals to Marxists to Islamic radicals. Eventually, a coalition was formed of these groups, liberals, Marxists, and Islamists, and they overthrew the Shah and kicked him out. When they did that, the major Islamic leader, Khomeini, ended up imprisoning all of his enemies or killing them off. Right after that, Americans who were in the embassy within Tehran were taken as hostage and held for over a year. Now, in the midst of all this, in 1976, a new president rose to power, President Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was from Georgia. He was a peanut farmer, and he used to play on the fact that he was an outsider to politics. He was coming in to clean things up. His way of doing that? Well, even though he was a liberal Democrat, he attempted to limit the size of government. He attempted to provide less regulations on business. He even put in a man into the Federal Reserve named Volcker, and Volcker attempted to raise interest rates in order to cut back on inflation. So in many ways, Jimmy Carter was sort of softening the liberal message. But by the end of the 1970s, inflation was going up pretty high. Afghanistan had been invaded by the Soviet Union, and The embassy in Iran had been taken over, and the hostages were held for over a year. Eventually, Jimmy Carter tried a plan to save these people in the embassy. Basically, a group of American helicopters would fly in and they would drop down on top of the embassy and evacuate all the people there. Instead, when these helicopters flew over the Saudi Arabian desert, a huge sandstorm kicked up and knocked them to the ground. Pictures the next day showed the American helicopters in disarray. This made the Americans look like they had no military power anymore. Jimmy Carter then went on national TV and he made a speech in which he tried to get Americans to rally behind the need to have things like energy conservancy and the need to have a stronger sense of nationalism. He said, right now we're in a malaise, or just kind of falling back on our American identity. It didn't go very well with the American public. And it eventually led to a new man who claimed that the Americans could rise to a sense of new identity and power and optimism, Ronald Reagan. And that started in the 1980s with the Reagan Revolution. See you in class.